Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump to a specific point in the video, you can find the chapter titles down in the video timeline, and that will allow you to jump directly to that section of the video. So I have 3 tidbits to talk about today. I also want to talk about stitch pattern names and expectations and confusion around those. I want to show you some new old books that I received in the mail in the past week or so. And then I'll give you an update on my 1890s sweater. So let's get started. If you subscribe to my channel and you have clicked on that little bell that gives you notifications and you have requested to get notifications by email when I upload a new video, as of August 13th, YouTube will no longer notify people by email. It's a really dumb decision, and the reasons for it are, I frankly feel, ludicrous. But regardless, if that's how you relied on finding out that I uploaded a new video, that isn't going to work anymore. What does still work, if you ask for notifications, if you use Chrome as your browser, when a new video is published, you'll get the little notification across the top of the screen. Or if you have the YouTube app on your mobile device and somehow it's open or something, you'll get a notification, I imagine. But let me just tell you how I find out when somebody has uploaded a new video that I subscribe to. I don't usually rely on those notifications. So I have YouTube as a bookmark across the top of my browser. I have all these little bookmarks for websites I go to a lot, like Ravelry or YouTube or Netflix or whatever. But I don't just go to the YouTube home screen, I go to my subscription feed. So that's what my bookmark is. So if that's not something that you have known about or done before, that might be an alternative to getting email notifications. I think it was on Twitter, this came up in my feed. Somebody posted this link to an article on knitting sheaths, and those are those kind of wooden needle holders that people would keep in their waistband, and they would use the long needles to knit with. So it's an article. The article was actually published in 2017, but somebody posted about it this week for some reason. But it has a lot of really cool pictures of different kinds of knitting sheaths and even photographs, which is really rare, of somebody using one where you can actually see where the sheath is. So I'll leave a link down in the video description where you can see that article if you would like. So the third thing is, last week I was telling you about how in the past, when I've knitted a sweater where I get the correct stitch gauge but my row gauge is different, how I've sometimes needed to recalculate shaping, like sleeves, which occur over a long period of time, and there's multiple increases or decreases. And if I didn't recalculate them, I could end up being done with all the shaping 3 or 4 inches too soon, or I could end up having the length I needed and not having finished the shaping. And I asked you guys, would you like me to do a video on that? And the answer to that question was a resounding yes. So I will be doing that video very shortly. I think I'm going to be doing that this Tuesday. If not this Tuesday, it'll be next Tuesday. But that video will be coming soon because apparently you guys really want to see that. So just want to let you know that. I often talk about how there is a lot of ambiguity in knitting, and that ambiguity comes from the fact that there are multiple techniques that will get you to the same endpoint, and they may not be recognizable as being the same thing. There are techniques that have more than one name. The same technique might have more than one name. The same name for a technique might actually apply to more than one different technique. That happens all of the time. So one of the ways that you get around that ambiguity is by using a pattern that defines all of the terms, all of the abbreviations, all of the stitch patterns, all of the chart symbols that you are going to use in the context of this particular project. So anytime you are knitting a project and it says use this particular stitch pattern, and you think you know what they're talking about, you might want to just refer to the section that defines the stitch patterns to make sure that what you are thinking of as a particular stitch pattern is what the designer is referring to. Because the only reason really to name a stitch pattern is in order to differentiate it from another stitch pattern that you might come across in the same place. And in the same place, that might be in the same book, it might be the same stitch dictionary. How do you separate this pattern from that pattern and define it differently? Or it could be just a project pattern. Within the context of this project pattern, how do we differentiate between the 3 or 4 different stitch patterns that are going to be used? Well, we have to define them and give them a name. Sometimes designers will give them an actual name, and sometimes they'll just give it a number. So some stitch dictionaries just number the different stitch patterns, and some of them will give them a name. And for the most common stitch patterns, there are often pretty frequently used labels for those things, but you still get ambiguity. And that's what I want to show you right now. So I have these 3 stitch patterns here. They're in a family that I would call the moss stitch family. That's a name I made up myself. I'm sure other knitters have called this group of stitches by that name or a similar name or some completely different name or no name at all. But I consider these stitch patterns to be in a family. So this one is worked by alternating a knit one with a purl one all the way across the row. And then on the next row, if it looks like a knit, you purl it. If it looks like a purl, you knit it. That would be true if you were knitting in the round as well. That when you get to a knit stitch, you purl it. When you get to a purl stitch, you knit it. It looks the same on both sides of the fabric. This is a 4-row repeat. This one's a 2-row repeat because you're offsetting what you're doing each row. This one's a 4-row repeat. And what this one is again, you're alternating a knit one with a purl one all the way across the row. But on the second row or the second round, if it looks like a knit, you knit it. If it looks like a purl, you purl it. So in other words, you're knitting the stitches the same way that they present, we call it. So the first 2 rows are worked so that the stitches are stacked on top of each other. It looks, if you don't look at any of the other rows, it looks like knit one, purl one ribbing. But then on the row number 3, that's when you do the offset. So then on row 3, if it looks like a knit, you purl it. If it looks like a purl, you knit it. So if you're knitting a flat piece of work, then you know that on wrong side rows, you just knit things the way they present. And on right side rows, you switch the way you are working the stitches. And then you get this 4-row repeat of stitches. So this one is also a 4-row repeat, but this time you're doing knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2 all the way across the row. And the second row, you do the same thing that you did with that previous one. You knit the stitches as they present. So when you look at just those first 2 rows, it looks like knit 2, purl 2, ribbing. And then on row 3, then you shift them and you work the stitches opposite of how they present. Another way of describing these is to say this is knit 1, purl 1 across the row and knit 1, purl 1 going up the columns. This one is knit 1, purl 1 across the row, but knit 2, purl 2 up the columns. This is knit 2, purl 2 across the row, and this is knit 2, purl 2 up the columns. So they're very similar to each other. They're just each on different scales. And I would call this the moss stitch family. So let me tell you what the names are. So in the US, seed stitch, moss stitch, double moss stitch, or double seed stitch. In the UK, moss stitch, double moss stitch, or possibly Irish moss, box stitch. So did you hear that? That there's a moss stitch and a double moss stitch in the US and in the UK, but they don't refer to the same stitch patterns. It doesn't stop there. Those aren't the only names. Let me show you some other names for these stitch patterns. This is from Practical Knitting Illustrated, which was published in 1940. And what you see here, right here, so this is a UK publication. So this is the one that's US seed stitch, but they call it moss stitch. And then they have these two stitch patterns here. This one, they're calling this one double moss stitch long. So this is the one that the US would call moss stitch, but the UK might call double moss or Irish moss. And in this book, they are calling it double moss, but they're calling it double moss long. This one, they're calling double moss wide. And this is not one that I had a swatch of. And what's going on here is alternating knit 2, purl 2 across the row, and then on the next row, working the stitches opposite of how they present. So you have knit 2, purl 2 across the row, but knit 1, purl 1 going up the columns. This is a book published in 1936 in the United States. And what you see here on these two pages, we've got one down here, and this one is calling this one rice or seed stitch. So this is a US publication and they're using that familiar seed stitch, but they're also calling this rice stitch. I should let you know that there is another stitch pattern that is known as rice stitch, and this isn't it. So this stitch pattern has two names, and one of the names is also used for a different stitch pattern. This one says double rice or seed stitch, so meaning double rice or double seed stitch. And this is the one that today I would call double seed stitch or double moss stitch here in the US, and they would call box stitch in the UK. So this is Vogue Knitting Stittionary, so they're calling that one seed stitch. Vogue is calling this one moss stitch, even though what this one is knit 2, purl 2 across the row and knit 2, purl 2 up the columns. So this is calling this a moss stitch, which is completely different from the moss stitch that normally you hear about in the US or the UK. It's a Harmony Guide to Knitting Stitches. They have a page here where you can see they have moss stitch number 1, and that's the one that I would call seed stitch, but in the UK is frequently known as moss stitch, and the Harmony Guides are from the UK. So knit 1, purl 1 across, knit 1, purl 1 up, and it's moss stitch 1 because they have moss stitch 2, which is the same thing, but they are changing colors. And then over here you see box stitch, which is knit 2, purl 2 across, knit 2, purl 2 up the columns. So this is Barbara Walker's A Treasury of Knitting Patterns. So it's the first treasury, and that means she's going to have the most basic stitch patterns of any particular family. So the most basic cables, the most basic lace, the most basic texture patterns, tons more besides that, but the basic ones are going to be in this book. What you see here is seed stitch, and what she is calling seed stitch is the one that is alternating knit 1, purl 1 across and knit 1, purl 1 up the columns. This middle one here, she's calling moss stitch, which is knit 1, purl 1 across the row and knit 2, purl 2 up the columns. And then she's calling this one double seed, which is knit 2, purl 2 across, knit 2, purl 2 up. But she also says probably should be called double moss stitch, since like moss stitch, it requires 4 rows to complete the pattern. So, and as you've seen, when you look at all of these different sources, any one of these 3 stitch patterns might be called moss stitch. So it probably wasn't surprising to a lot of you about the US terms for these 3 stitch patterns versus the UK names. You may already have been familiar with them. I certainly was. But it was really interesting to me to, as I've been going back in time, to see the fact that there was even more variety of names for those particular stitch patterns as I went further and further back in time. What I didn't show you was a book that I got recently that was from, I think, 1908 or 1910, and it had some sweater patterns in it. And so you could see the model, you know, wearing the sweater, but you couldn't really see what the stitch patterns were. And so they have a section before all the sweaters, and where they would show close-ups of those stitch patterns, and they just labeled them sweater pattern number 1, sweater pattern number 2, sweater pattern number 3, etc. And 2 of those sweater patterns were seed stitch and double moss stitch, as I would call them, but they didn't give them a label. In the 19th century, what I'm seeing is that they rarely gave a stitch pattern an actual name. They would just refer to it within the context of the actual project pattern, fancy stitch pattern, and then they would define how that was worked. They did have labels for things like double knitting and brioche each of those had multiple ways of being worked, and some knitting books would define only one method of double knitting and one method of brioche, and others would define multiple methods of doing each of those techniques. And I found it really interesting how often double knitting and brioche were used. But I think it's because the 19th century, there's no central heating, and they were relying on layers to keep warm. And those wool knit layers, they were really taking advantage of stitch patterns that provided a double layers of warmth, like double knitting does, or brioche, which relies on compressing the row gauge and really making a fluffy stitch pattern that will hold a lot of air. And these early sweater patterns were mostly knit in knit one, purl one ribbing. And that's because they really felt like ribbing was the warmest stitch pattern, and it would hug the body as well. So if you were making an underwear layer that was made that was from knitted wool, it would be in ribbing and it would conform to the body. But if it was something that was just decorative and interesting, like a knit purl pattern or a lace pattern or something like that, they typically did not give them a name at all. So I have 4 new vintage and antique and reproduction knitting manuals that I've received that were originally published between 1884 and 1968. So pretty large range. You can probably tell that this one is the most recent from 1968. I'm really enjoying looking at when I can find them, books from the 50s and 60s to kind of see how knitting techniques and approaches are shifting as we head into the 70s. This book in particular has some really interesting constructions and instructions for knitting sweaters that I was somewhat surprised to see based on information that I'd heard in the past, such as this colorwork sweater right here is knit in the round with stranded colorwork, and then the knitting is cut to open the armholes as you would do for steeks nowadays, and which was, is traditional in Scandinavian knitting and Shetland knitting, but it was kind of, I felt like, unheard of back at this time. The whole point of getting these manuals is to sort of disprove what I think I know about knitting and try to learn as much as I can. One of the other things that I look for in these books is to see any signs of mattress stitch, that kind of thing. And so they're still showing here back stitching seams, but they're also showing what they called weaving vertical seams. And it's what I would call a mattress stitch, but it's only a half a stitch at each edge. They often, instead of calling it grafting in the United States, they will call it weaving. And you never know with these woven seams during these mid-century times if they actually want you to go up the center of a stitch or if they're asking you to catch a leg of the selvage stitch, the outer leg of the selvage stitch. So this has been really fascinating to look through this and see some of the constructions and how they were doing things. It's always fun also to look at the hair and the hairstyles. So that's the one that was published most recently. This is not the book that I was thinking it was. I have a different reproduction from the same person, and it's a Fleischer's manual, but it's from 1910. So these two are my oldest acquisitions. This one is from 1884, and it's in pretty poor condition. It's called The Young Lady's Journal, Complete Guide to the Work Table. And you can see that the spine is kind of pulled apart. But what's interesting about that is you can see that they used newspaper to help support the binding in the back. And this contains, you can see there are 3 people who wrote their names in here who had owned it at one time. Contains instructions in Berlin work, crochet, drawn thread work, embroidery, knitting, knotting or macrame, lace, netting, Poonah painting, and tatting. So I had heard of all of these except for Poonah painting, and I was kind of interested in what that was. But I was especially interested also in what sorts of knitting patterns were in here. So they have all the patterns listed, and they include instructions for how to do things. I think the instructions, and you can see like some of the pages are not in good condition. It's really not a great condition book, so I will be very, very careful with it. So the knitting section starts here, and it's full directions for plain and fancy knitting. They talk about, they have a few of these little colored illustrations in here that are put inside to show you how something would look. These are actually engravings. They're not painted photographs, they're engravings. So a pence jug was like a penny jar. You'd keep your coins in there. So they explain things like the materials that you need, like the equipment that you might need. And then they show you how to do casting on in a couple of different ways. They have casting on with one needle, and which is like the long tail type of cast on. Although this one might just be a backwards loop, I'm not sure. So they have various different items, and what they'll have is every so often, I've seen these in some of these other books, they'll have a page of engravings that show you what these things look like, and they're numbered, and so when you find the pattern later on, it'll tell you number such and such, and so then you know if you have a picture of it. Sometimes they'll show details that you may not be able to tell in terms of how to construct it or how to put things together, or they'll give you close-ups of the stitch pattern. So that's really nice. There's another set of engravings, so the mittens, but a lot of things like lace insertions or little edgings that you might want to use. But I was interested to know, what is Poonah painting? And it says to paint flowers, foliage, etc., including a new colored design, illustrated diagrams, and it's Poonah painting on velvet, satin, silk, card, paper, or wood. And, containing directions for cutting and varnishing formulas. I'm like, what is all of this? And so what you see is, you see this drawing right here, and they have this thing right here, these little X's, conducting point, and they have all of these are numbered. And they show you how to trace these. So these are all of the things that are numbered number 1. And these are all the elements that are number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. What these are, I looked this up. This is stencil painting. So it was called, in England, apparently it was called Poonah painting because they believed that this was a technique that came from a place in India called Poonah, P-U-N-E. Here in the United States, well, there was another name for it, and it was called Theorem painting. So the stencils were called Theorems. And I am going to link to a video that kind of shows some examples of Poonah painting or Theorem painting to give you a little bit of idea of what how they would do this, because I couldn't quite figure out what was going on by looking at these drawings, how it works. So this is my favorite book that I have bought, my vintage or antique book. This is the Columbia Book of the Use of Yarns. It's the 2nd edition. It was published in January of 1901, and I cannot believe how good the condition of this book is. There's a little bit of a fold right along here and maybe on the back too, but this is a paperback book. It's got a little bit of a tear here, but when you look inside, look at how white the pages are. And here's, this is a colored embroidery page that came from some other book that was stuck in here, which I thought was interesting. And there was another thing that was inside as well that I found, which was cut from a quarterly women's needlework magazine called The Modern Priscilla. And it's this knitted kneecap. You find these patterns in all of these old books, these knitted kneecaps. And I'm like, I don't understand if it's, maybe that it's because they're riding in carriages and their knees get cold. I don't quite understand why specifically they like to cover their knees, but they did. So this particular pattern was cut out, is advertising another issue of the Columbia Book of Yarns, but they're advertising the 6th edition. So this is the 2nd in 1901, and so it was probably they're advertising the edition from 1905, which I have not seen anywhere. My very first antique pattern that I knit from was from the Columbia Book of Yarns from 1904. And so I've seen the 1904, 1907, and 1908, but I haven't seen the one that they're talking about. You can see, though, not everybody knew how to knit. They're telling you, learn to knit. here. There's this misconception that everybody knew how to knit back then and they were all experts, and they clearly were not. On the back side, they have part of a pattern for a hug me tight, and this is another word for a garment that people would wear just around their upper body as a layer, and usually sleeveless, but maybe sometimes would have sort of half sleeves to it. But it's just something to wrap around you as another layer to keep you warmer. And one of the names was Hug Me Tight. They had chest protectors. Sometimes they'd call them jackets, even though they aren't a jacket like we'd think about it today. Bosom Friend was another name. They had a lot of names for those. So this was from the Modern Priscilla, which was a quarterly needlework magazine. Some of the other things that you'll see on here, they have this advertisement here for art silk. So art silk is actually a name for artificial silk, meaning rayon. So rayon was the first, it was really a semi-synthetic yarn. It's made from it's synthesized from natural materials. So rayon is always something. It could be bamboo, it could be tree fiber, it could be, you know, a variety of different sorts of cellulose items that are run through a chemical process and turned into rayon. So that was the very first fake or synthetic fiber, and they called it art silk. So of course I was very interested in the sweater patterns that were in this book, and there's only a couple. One men's sweater, a small boy's sweater, child's sweater, and then there's a lady's golf sweater. So it's interesting to compare the construction of this woman's sweater that was published in 1901 to the one that I knit that was published in 1904. So this is the beginning of the Edwardian era, and you can see that she doesn't have quite that big bloused fabric in the front that you see a couple of years later, so that's kind of fascinating. It's not opened in the front, so this was meant as a pullover. Later sweaters, especially as the hairstyles and the hats and everything got bigger, they made these into button-up sweaters so that they wouldn't have to get pulled on over their hairdos. But I was particularly interested in this sweater here. I want to point out something about these sweaters. First of all, I want to show you the hem of this sweater. Not only is it a different color, but you can tell it's done in a specific stitch pattern, but it's folded over. So it's hitting his hips at the place where you, like nowadays, you'd see a sweater hitting. But if this were unrolled, it would be quite a bit longer. And you see this little kid's sweater also flipped up at the hem. And this little girl, hers is also flipped up. What especially intrigued me about this sweater is this yoke business right here. So I read through these instructions and I took a really close look I took a photograph and then looked at this really close to see how this was actually constructed as I read through the directions, because I think this is similar but not identical to the sweater that I am attempting to knit right now. And so this gives me a little bit of a clue about what this sweater, how this yoke operates in this sweater versus how it's operating in the sweater that I'm knitting. They're not exactly the same. They just give me a few extra clues. I've had a lot of confusion about the sweater I'm knitting in terms of what's going on up in the upper body. And that is in part because I can't reconcile the number of rows that are going to be worked for each part with the length that's going to turn out to be. I've had people say, well, why can't you just measure the photograph and see how long each section is? And part of that is because the section that is different and weird that I don't understand, and the whole reason I'm knitting this sweater, is what happens. This sweater is knit in the round and then you split, so you're working just half each flat. And then you're supposed to rejoin right here and then work in the round. And as you work in the round, you are doing decreases only at the shoulder. The instructions imply that it's every 3 rounds, which means it would take like 54 rounds to complete it, which would be almost the same a length as the depth of these armholes. So if you see how long this armhole is, that would mean that that yoke would be all the way up like here, like that long. And then after you did that, then you would be knitting the actual turtleneck that's going to go straight up and fold over. And so what I couldn't tell was what was going on at the junction of the armhole, the sleeve caps. I couldn't tell if this was supposed to sit right at the top of the edge of the shoulders, if it was supposed to roll over, what was going on. I had a feeling it was supposed to sit right there at the top because they tell you to knit these sleeve caps starting here and going down. So I did them using short rows. That's how they instruct them. And so by the time you finally get all the way down to the bottom of the sleeve, and notice how kind of weird it looks as well. We'll see if it gets any better when I go further. But how long that sleeve cap is. So I think it's pretty clear that this is supposed to sit here at the top of the shoulders, and that there is supposed to be some sort of yoke thing going on similar to that pattern that's in that 1901 book. In that 1901 book, that is structured a little bit differently. In that book, you would have sewn together about 30% on each side. The shoulders would be, they wouldn't be sewn, but they would have just been worked. You would have worked flat all the way up to the shoulder and then all the way over and leaving a neck opening. And so in that case, these shoulders would be kind of half hanging over. They'd be on the top of the shoulder and then around the curve of the arm. And this opening, you wouldn't have a sleeve cap like this. You just have the sleeves coming down from that. They'd be picked up along the edge and be knit down. And so this one instead is going straight across and is supposed to be at the top of the shoulders. And so they create this cap in order to start the sleeves going down. It's kind of what I thought was going on, but I wasn't 100% sure. And so what I wanted to do was join these together, work a couple of rounds, and then get started on the sleeve caps to see what was really happening. And I was doing that, and then I got that book in the mail, and that kind of helped me see what was probably going on. I still think there's an issue with the rate, like how many rows have to be knit. What I can do at this point, now that I've seen how these sleeves are coming off the top of the shoulders and that is correct, and this is sitting right at the edge of the top of the shoulder, I can start working the yoke and see what that decrease rate does in terms of how much it adds at the top. If it's too much, if it will work, if I change the shaping rate and then play with it that way. But I needed to get this far to really understand what was going on, because the photograph is completely black. You can't see this line. And when they have the sleeves, then they have the sleeves folded over, so I couldn't tell what was happening. And this is the place where all of the weird stuff happens, and it isn't just obvious. That's why I couldn't just measure the picture, because I didn't know if this is going up straight or if there was something else happening that would cause the yoke to end up being longer. So I do think it's an issue with the length of the yoke, but we shall see. So you'll see I have a full cap done here, and the pickup rate looks weird. They have you pick up 1 stitch for every single row, and it's kind of lumpy. When it's worn, it doesn't look as bad, and I don't know what it'll be like once it's been washed either. I started this one using the instructions as they were written. What they have you do is pick up a certain number of stitches across the top, and then they want you to work across and then pick up 1 more stitch. And then work back across, pick up 1 more stitch, work back across, so that you're picking up as you go. I thought, well, I'm going to try it that way. That's how it's written. There's nothing that really indicates how they picked up stitches back then. They tended to say, pick up a loop at the selvage. There's some books from the 1930s that will show that And in that case, they're picking up in stockinette, and they're not having you pick up every row. They're having you pick up every 2 rows, and they're having you pick up where you see that twisted loop. They have you pick that up, and the edges don't look so great. But anyway, I thought, well, I'm going to try it that way. It creates kind of a holy mess. I just wasn't happy with this result. I felt I could get a better result doing it a different way, but I did want to try it the way that it was originally written. So what I did on this side was you pick up like 20 stitches right here, and then you go back and forth and picking up one more each time. So you pick up 20 to begin with, and then the rest of them are divided in thirds, and so you pick up one at a time for this third and that third. And once you've picked up all of those, then you pick up straight across the edge of you pick up all of the rest of them at one time. So what I did was I picked up starting at that 1/3 point. I picked up from here all the way up to down there. So I picked them up all at one time. Then I came back and I started doing the short row turns that way. And then I waited until the end to do all of this pickup. In a modern sleeve like this, typically what you do would be to pick up all of the stitches around the entire circumference and then do your short row shaping. But I wanted to try this way, where I did the initial pickup in one go and then the final pickup in one go, just to see how it worked, if it made any difference at all. And I've marked here the center of the underarm right there, because this is just split. There's no bind off edge here. It's just I split and started working the 2 halves, and so it creates kind of a weird underarm shape without having any bind offs there. I definitely think there have been improvements in how sweaters are constructed since then, but it's interesting just to see sort of how they did things and sort of the simplified version of certain things that they did, and yet at the same time they use some fairly sophisticated techniques for doing shaping. But I'm always interested in how they decide to do their short rows. So I meant to tell you guys this last week. It was on my list of things to mention about my sweater, and then it just slipped my mind. But I didn't want to just let it go. I really felt like it's good for you guys to see this. I often am talking about, well, I'm not sure what's going to happen here, and I'm going to try it this way, and if that doesn't work, I'm going to try it this other way, and I might rip things out and redo things, and expect to learn as I go and experiment and see what happens. I also make really boneheaded mistakes. I usually make some really dumb mistake every 2 or 3 projects, like big projects. I had knit the body in a tube, and then I had separated the 2 halves, each on their own waste yarn. And I think I did that so that I could try it on and see how it fit and see what the length was, because I decided to knit fewer rows for the body. I just decided that there was some kind of mistake in the pattern, and they must have meant 65 rows, not 105 rows of the red after the stripes were done. And so that's what I did. And so I had each half on its own waste yarn. And when it was time to put the sweater back on the needles, I took the needle I had been using to knit in the round, and I put all the stitches for the first half of the round, or for that, one half onto the needle, pulled the waste yarn out. And then, because I had been knitting so long on that circular needle for everything, I automatically started putting stitches from the second half on the same circular needle. And I got part of the way along, and then I'm like, oh no, I have to knit flat. So I need a second needle, a spare needle. I could just put it on a smaller needle and put this half on there. And I knew I had already started on the second half. I'd put some of those stitches. I counted up how many extras I had. It was 32. And so I knew that when I got my smaller needle and I was transferring all of the remaining stitches from waste yarn onto that needle, then I would need to also move 32 stitches from that first needle that had too many. I began knitting back and forth until I'd worked about 4,500 stitches altogether. And as I was knitting along, I could tell that something just didn't feel right with the knitting. I felt like when I would refer to my spreadsheet, I'd say how many rows I had knit, and I would see what that resulting stitch count was. I would think, geez, it feels like I knit more than that. It's so weird. And then I would do another update. I'm like, it just feels like I knit more than that. Maybe I'm just getting bored with doing knit one, purl one ribbing. I don't know. And it also felt like, geez, you know, for knitting just across this half of the sweater, it's weird that I feel like I keep going around a corner. Red flags, ignored them. At the same time, I kept thinking I should have knit the body longer. I should have knit the body longer. Maybe I should rip this back and then add a few more inches onto the body. Oh, but I've come so far. I don't want to do that. On and on and on and on for row after row after row. And finally, I was going to get up from my desk to do something, and I put the sweater down, and I saw this. I will put a picture up for you. And that's when I realized that why it felt like I had knit more stitches, why it felt like I was going around a corner. It wasn't easy to knit flat back and forth. But it also meant that I had to rip back and knit the body a couple of inches longer. And so I did that. But it was 4,500 stitches that I had to rip back. That's a couple of days worth of knitting that I had to rip back. But I just wanted you to know that I'm a very experienced knitter. I still make dumb mistakes, and I just have to deal with them and then move on. And sometimes that means if I'm really disgusted with myself, I might give the project a timeout for a while, for a day or two, or even a couple of months, depending on the project. But I make those kind of boneheaded mistakes frequently enough that you'd think I'd have some sort of checklist, but I don't. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.